In the vast windswept reaches of the western plains, where the land stretched out in golden silence and the sky poured blue for miles, there lived a man named Elias Granger. To the few who knew his name, he was a mystery. To those who didn't, he was a ghost riding the border of civilization and wilderness, a figure glimpsed at the trading post twice a year, a shadow on horseback vanishing into the horizon, a man of very few words and even fewer smiles. His ranch sat nestled between two ridges of granite, long believed to be sacred ground by the native tribes who once called it home. But Elias had not claimed the land out of greed or conquest. He had found it empty, neglected, overgrown, behind after blood had been shed on both sides in wars no one wanted to remember. He had rebuilt the cabin himself, chopping timber with hands that had once known gentler things. There was no one to help him, no one to call, no family, no partner, only the echo of his axe in the cold morning and the lowing of cattle at dusk. He had a dog once, but even it had died some winters ago, and Elias hadn't bothered to replace him. He was a man resigned to silence, not out of bitterness, but habit, a creature of pattern and isolation. He rose before dawn, fed the horses and the chickens, mended fences, dug trenches, fixed leather, chopped firewood, and worked the land as if it was the only thing keeping his heart from turning to stone. People in the nearest town, Peen Hollow, a cluster of wooden buildings that slouched against the wind, spoke of him with a curious mixture of awe and sorrow. "He ain't never taken a woman," said old Bert, who ran the general store. "Not since he got here 10 years back. Man, keeps to himself like he's carrying some heavy ghost." Some speculated he had lost a wife and child back east in some fire or sickness. Others swore he had once been a preacher who turned his back on God. No one knew for sure, and Elias never gave them cause to ask. He wore the same hat year-round, patched at the crown but always clean. His boots were polished, though scuffed at the toe. His rifle was always close by, but no one had ever seen him raise it in anger. He drank only water and coffee, read old almanacs by lantern light, and spoke only when spoken to, and even then his answers were clipped, courteous, distant. The saloon girls said he had kind eyes, but there was something guarded behind them, like a man who had locked the door to his soul and lost the key long ago. It wasn't that Elias feared people, it was that he didn't see much point in them anymore. He had perhaps once, when he was young and foolish and still believed in the firelight of dreams. But time had a way of taking things. First, it took his father shot in a petty land dispute. Then his mother worn out by grief and fever. Then his little brother lost during the long journey west, taken by outlaws or illness or worse. Elias had never found the body, just a bloodstained scarf in the dirt. By the time he crossed the final range into these wildlands, he had nothing left to protect, nothing left to share. And so he built his fences high and his walls higher. He spoke to his horses because they didn't lie. He named his cows out of a dark sense of humor, justice, mercy, faith. And so Andan laughed at his own jokes because no one else would. He kept a Bible in his drawer, unopened, not out of anger toward God, but because he didn't know what to ask of him anymore. He had stopped asking for miracles. He had stopped expecting change. He had settled into his own skin like a worn saddle, uncomfortable, but familiar. That winter had come earlier than most. The winds arrived before the leaves had fully turned, carrying with them the scent of distant snow and something else, something heavier. The animals sensed it before Elias did. The birds had migrated too early. Coyotes cried at odd hours. Even the horses seemed uneasy, stamping and snorting at the night. Elias chalked it up to weather. He always did. There were things he refused to consider, like omens, or intuition, or longing. But on that particular evening, just as the sky bled orange and the shadows lengthened across the fields, he noticed something unusual. A set of tracks leading through the snow. Small, uneven, not animal, human, and fresh. His breath misted in the cold as he followed them along the edge of his property, his rifle slung over his shoulder but untouched. He didn't expect visitors. He hadn't had one in over a year, not since the preacher had come asking if Elias wanted salvation and had left with a bruised ego and frostbite. The tracks led to a small hill near the creek, and there, huddled against a tree, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20, though the weather and exhaustion made her look older. Her hair, dark and tangled, clung to her face in frozen strands. Her lips were cracked. Her fingers, bare and blue, clutched a ragged piece of cloth to her chest. Her legs were trembling. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. Elias had seen wolves in better shape. He stood there for a moment, just watching, unsure if she was real or some figment of his solitude, some cruel mirage, sent by the cold to break him. But then her eyes lifted to his. They were wide and dark, and full of something ancient, fear, yes, but also something deeper, exhaustion, desperation, and beneath it all, a flicker of trust. As if, even in her broken state, she sensed something in Elias Granger that the world had not completely taken. He didn't think. He moved. He shrugged off his coat, his only coat, the thick sheepskin lined with wool, the one that had seen him Through blizzards and storms, the one possession he kept meticulously clean and dry and draped it around her shoulders. She flinched at first, her body recoiling instinctively, but then sagged forward into the warmth. Her lips moved, trying to form a word. Nothing came. Elias caught her before she fell. She was lighter than expected, frail as paper, her body like a bundle of bones wrapped in skin. He cradled her in his arms and carried her back toward the cabin, each step through the snow echoing louder than the last. He hadn't touched another human being in years. The feel of her against his chest shook him more than the cold. Not in any romantic way, not yet. It was something deeper, protective, ancient, human. Inside the cabin, he laid her near the fire, wrapped her in blankets, boiled water, and fed her spoonfuls of broth he had been saving for himself. He didn't ask questions, not yet. He watched as her chest rose and fell with shallow, uneven breaths. Her fingers twitched, her lips moved. Then, finally, she whispered a single word before sleep took her. North. And Elias Granger, the man who had known silence for a decade, sat beside her through the night, not knowing what she meant but knowing, with a certainty he hadn't felt in years, that his life had just shifted and there would be no going back. The weight of her body in his arms was a contradiction to light for someone still breathing, yet somehow heavy with the burden of all she had suffered to get here. Elias had carried logs heavier than this girl. He had lifted sacks of grain through storms, but this fragile, unconscious girl, wrapped in his only coat, felt like she carried the whole weight of the winter on her shoulders. And as he trudged through the knee-high snow back to the cabin, Elias couldn't help but feel like something ancient and sacred had just been placed into his hands, and he was wholly unprepared to bear it. He didn't speak, he didn't think. His body moved on instinct, one step at a time, his boots crunching through the white silence. The wind had quieted, almost respectfully, as if even nature was watching. Above him, the sky was bruised with stars, and the air had turned sharper than a knife. His breath came in bursts, clouding around his face, but the only warmth he felt was the dwindling heat coming off the girl in his arms. Her head lolled slightly against his chest, and he tightened his grip, careful not to jostle her too much. He could feel her heartbeat slow, unsteady, faint as if it flickered like the last coal in a dying fire. She didn't stir, but once, as they neared the front porch of the cabin, her lips parted in a breathless whispered sound. It wasn't a word, just a sound, a broken echo of pain, or memory, or both. Elias kicked open the door with one boot and stepped inside, letting the warmth of the fire greet them. He had stoked it high before he left. Years of living alone had taught him never to let the hearth die, not even for a short trip. Fire was life out here. Without it, everything turned to frost. Carefully, he laid the girl on a woven buffalo hide near the fireplace and peeled off the snow-covered coat. Her skin was ghost pale, her cheeks hollow, her limbs trembling even. In the heat, he moved quickly, methodically. First, he stripped off her wet rags, not out of immodesty or indecency, but necessity. Wet clothes meant death in this cold. He wrapped her in the warmest blankets he had to wool, one furlong, set a pot of water to boil. Every action he took was driven by an old memory of helping his mother tend to a frostbitten traveler back east. She had taught him then that saving someone from winter was like coaxing a lost soul back from the edge. Slow, careful, patient. He soaked a cloth in warm water and gently wiped the ice from her brow, her cheeks, the corners of her mouth. Her eyelashes fluttered once, and he leaned in, hoping for a word, a sign, anything, but her eyes remained closed. Her breathing was shallow. Her hands remained clenched around the tattered piece of fabric she had clutched when he found her, something small, stained, torn, and sacred-looking. He didn't try to pry it from her. Elias didn't ask questions. Not yet. He ladled a thin broth made of elk bone, wild herbs, and dried vegetables into a tin mug and held it to her lips. She didn't drink at first. Her mouth remained slightly open, her teeth clenched. But then her throat spasmed, and she sipped, barely. The warmth must have reached her core, because a moment later, she shuddered. A long, full-body shudder that ended with a quiet gasp, as if some part of her had finally given itself permission to believe she was safe. He watched her closely as she swallowed another sip. Her hands, still trembling, moved slightly beneath the blankets, her brow furrowed. Her lips began to move again, forming something now. Elias leaned closer, and then softly, barely audible, came a word. North. Just that. One word, one direction. Elias felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't recognition, he didn't know what it meant. But the way she said it, with such pain, such pleading, it wasn't just a word. It was a request, a warning, a destination, a memory, or all of those things at once. He whispered back, though he didn't know why. You're safe now. The words felt foreign in his own mouth. He hadn't said them to anyone in years. Maybe not ever. But in that moment, speaking to a girl he didn't know, who might not even live through the night, they felt like the only thing that mattered. He reached for another blanket and covered her again. The fire crackled behind him, filling the room with dancing light. The flickers played across her face, revealing a soft curve to her cheekbone, a healed scar across her left brow, and a faint tattoo inked just below her collarbone. Something tribal, something old. He didn't recognize the symbol, but it felt like something ceremonial, a rite, a belonging. She had not come from nowhere, and yet, she had come alone. Elias returned to his rocking chair, a short distance from her, and sat with his rifle across his lap, not as a threat, but as a habit. He kept his eyes on her through the night. Once or twice, she stirred, murmuring words in a language he didn't understand. They were lyrical, soft, and mournful, perhaps names, perhaps prayers. He didn't try to interpret them. Instead, he studied her and wondered what fate had dragged her to his doorstep. Was she fleeing someone? Something? A lost tribe? A broken promise? What kind of strength did it take to walk through that storm, that distance, in her condition? And what had happened to her that pushed her to that edge? Elias didn't know, but he felt something rising inside him he hadn't felt in years, maybe ever. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't pity. It was something more primal, protective. It was the same feeling he had once felt as a boy when he found a baby bird fallen from its nest and cupped it in his hands. That ache of, I will not let this one die. Not if I can help it. The hours passed. The fire dimmed. Elias added more wood. Outside, the storm howled, but the cabin stood firm. The girl's breathing grew a little stronger. Her color began to return. Subtly, her fingers uncurled slightly. He noticed that the tightness in her face had eased, and though her eyes didn't open, it felt as if she had begun to rest. Truly rest. Elias sat through the night, never sleeping. The wind carried strange sounds through the window, whispers of coyotes, creaking of trees, the distant moan of something ancient and cold. But inside the cabin, there was peace. Fragile, flickering peace. And Elias knew, without understanding how, that his life had already changed, not in some dramatic thunderclap way, but deeply, quietly, irrevocably. This girl, this shivering, near-dead stranger had stumbled into his life like a breath of color into a world gone gray, and though he did not know her name, her story, or what tomorrow would bring, he knew this. He had taken her in when no one else had. He had given her warmth, his jacket, his fire, his food. And now, in the long silence between night and morning, he had given her something more. Hope, even if she never woke again. Elias would remember her as the moment the silence of his ears cracked open, just enough to let the wind in, or the light, or the past, or maybe all three. Outside, dawn was beginning to break, and he did not yet know what was coming. The fire flickered low, sending shifting shadows across the cabin walls, but Elias Granger did not move from his chair. The girl lay wrapped in blankets near the hearth, her breathing soft but steady now. Outside, the storm still moaned like a restless spirit over the open plains, rattling the shutters, clawing at the door with icy fingers. But Elias didn't notice the cold anymore. His eyes stayed locked on her, this stranger who had stumbled into his life like some forgotten angel fallen from the sky. He hadn't intended to keep watch, but the thought of sleep seemed impossible. His body may have been tired, his back aching from the long ride earlier that morning, his hands stiff from the cold, but his mind was sharp, alert, listening, watching, not just for danger, for something else, something he couldn't quite name. For a man like Elias, used to routine and silence, even the smallest disruption could ripple deep. But this wasn't small. This was seismic. He had brought a near-dead girl into his home. A girl with tribal markings, with unknown enemies, with secrets written in bruises and silence. A girl who might not live through the night, and though he told himself he was just doing what any decent man would do, he knew it wasn't true. This wasn't duty, it was something deeper. Somewhere around midnight, the fire snapped sharply, and the girl stirred. Elias leaned forward, his heart suddenly thudding louder in his ears. Her brow furrowed, and she let out a low moan, not pain, exactly, but memory. The kind that slips into dreams when you aren't looking. She began to murmur words again, a language soft and melodic, full of vowels and wind sound. He couldn't understand them, but their rhythm suggested sorrow like a lullaby sung over a battlefield. Then more clearly came a name, Anaka. Her voice cracked around it. Elias sat motionless, wondering if it was her name or someone else's. A lost sister, a child, a tribe. The word clung to the air like smoke, refusing to fade. He stood slowly and walked over to her, kneeling beside the fire. Her skin still held a chill, but the color had returned to her lips. Her hair was dry now, splayed across the folded furs like ink on snow. He reached out, hesitated, then brushed a loose strand from her brow. Her eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. The words felt strange in his throat, dry with rust. The girl did not answer, but her hand shifted beneath the blankets just slightly, enough to make Elias believe she had heard him. The fire crackled again, louder this time, and he added more wood. The warmth filled the room like breath, pushing back the cold that scraped along the windows. Elias poured himself a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and sat back in his rocking chair, the rifle still across his lap. He wasn't expecting trouble, but old habits didn't die easy. He thought about the word she'd said earlier, north. It wasn't just direction. There was weight in that word, fear, maybe, or hope. as if she was either running from something terrible or toward something precious. Either way, she hadn't made it. She'd collapsed on his land, of all places. A man who hadn't spoken to another soul in nearly 2 years, save the storekeep in Pine Hollow and the postman who rode through once a month. Why her? Why now? The more he thought about it, the less it made sense. And yet, part of him didn't want it to make sense. He had spent so long building a fortress of silence around his life that he'd forgotten how loud the heart could beat when it had something or someone to care about. It was strange, this feeling. Protective, anchoring, not desire. Not yet, something more primal. Like recognizing another soul standing at the same edge you once faced. He remembered. Then, the last time he had seen someone that close to death. It had been years ago before the cabin, before the ranch when he was drifting from one mining camp to another, selling muleskins and handmade tack. He'd come across a small settlement in Wyoming territory, snowbound and starving. A boy had fallen through ice and been pulled out barely breathing. Elias had sat with him all night, keeping the fire lit, warming his limbs with hot stones. The boy had lived, but Elias had left the next morning without saying goodbye. He hadn't thought about that moment in years. But now, sitting here, he remembered the weight of it. The fear, the quiet joy of saving someone, and the pain of never knowing what became of them. He looked at the girl again. He didn't want to wonder this time, he wanted her to live. And that terrified him more than anything. Hours passed. The storm outside began to ease. The winds softened, as if exhausted from their fury. Snow fell in gentler waves. The world hushed itself. Inside the cabin, the silence grew thicker. Elias paced, slow and thoughtful. Every few minutes, he would check the girl's breath, adjust the blankets, refresh the water. He had never been a caretaker, but the motions came naturally. He didn't question it. It was like the earth itself had shifted beneath him, and now this was his purpose. At one point, he sat beside her, leaned close, and murmured, "You'll make it, girl, you have to." She moved again. This time her hand emerged from beneath the blankets, still gripping that torn piece of cloth. Elias finally saw it fully now. It was not just fabric. It was ceremonial, beaded on one edge, a torn sash, a piece of a larger garment. It was deeply stained, but not with blood, at least, not only blood. There were marks of ash, soil, even ceremonial paint. He didn't touch it, not yet. He respected sacred things. The clock above the mantel ticked softly. 1 in the morning, then 2, then 3. Elias made more coffee, chewed a biscuit. He never took his eyes off her. At one point, he thought about praying. He sat, elbows on knees, staring into the fire with clenched hands. He hadn't spoken to God in years. But now, with this girl fighting for life a few feet away, he found himself muttering into the smoke, "Let her live, please." No thunder answered. No voice replied. But somehow, he felt heard. The girl stirred again, more violently this time. Her body spasmed as if fighting some memory. Her breath caught. She whispered something again, frantic and pained. This time Elias recognized the tone. It was fear, pure, raw fear. He crouched beside her, put a steadying hand on her arm. "You're safe," he said again. "You're warm. You're home for now." The words seemed to reach her. She still outside. The sky began to gray. Dawn was coming. Elias rose and walked to the window. He saw the vast stretch of white snow under the soft light of early morning. Everything looked peaceful, untouched, pure. But something gnawed at his gut, a sense of something approaching. Not a threat exactly, but a presence. He turned back to the girl. Her chest rose and fell. Her lips were slightly parted. Her brow had smoothed. She was still with him. Elias sat down and waited. It had been the longest night of his life, and somehow, he sensed that it was only the beginning. The first light of dawn came slowly, brushing the horizon in muted tones of lavender and gold. A fine mist clung to the surface of the snow, turning Elias's ranch into something ghostly still and untouched, as if the land itself were holding its breath. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind silence so pure that it hummed. It was the kind of morning where time felt suspended, where even the wind hesitated before rustling the branches of the dead cottonwoods along the creek. Elias stood at the window, a tin mug of lukewarm coffee cradled in his weathered hands. His torrent's eyes swept the snow-covered plains, alert but unhurried. The fire inside crackled gently, casting light on the girl still wrapped in blankets near the hearth. She had not stirred since the early hours, though her color had improved, her breathing more rhythmic, stronger. Elias hadn't dared move her yet. Whatever hell she had endured, whatever miles she had crossed to collapse at his gate, her body was still healing, but he sensed something else, now something just beneath the calm, a quiet tension. He hadn't slept, but he didn't feel tired. Years of solitude had made him a man of stillness, of observation. He had learned to read signs others ignored: wind shifts, animal behavior, subtle changes in light and noise. And now, something whispered to his bones. Not a sound, not a shadow, a feeling. Something was coming. He slipped on his boots and stepped outside, pulling his long rifle with him, out of instinct more than fear. The cold bit at his cheeks, but he didn't flinch. He stood on the porch, his eyes scanning the ridgelines beyond the fence. Snow crunched underfoot, brittle and sharp. The landscape was vast, white, undisturbed. His cattle were still in the lower pastures, their figures just specks against the sea of frost. Then he saw it. Bot movement dashed just a flicker on the northern ridge. He squinted, raising a hand to shade his eyes. The rising sun caught on something reflected metal. No, it shimmered like polished bone or flint. Then more movement. Dozens of them. Shadows against the skyline. And then it became clear. Horsemen. They came in silence, 200 strong, emerging from the forest edge and lining the ridgeline with quiet precision, not charging, not advancing, just watching, waiting. A wall of mounted warriors, painted faces, stoic beneath eagle feathers and fur-lined cloaks. Each man carried a bow, a spear, or a rifle slung across his back. But none of their weapons were drawn. Elias lowered his rifle. It wasn't necessary. This was not an ambush. This was a statement. He took a slow step forward off the porch, his boots sinking into snow. The warriors did not move. They simply held their ground, forming an unbroken line across the rise, as if they had been summoned by the wind itself. The morning light turned their breath to steam. Their horses shifted but made no sound. It was the most powerful silence Elias had ever witnessed. And then, behind him, the cabin door creaked open. He turned to see Hertha, a girl standing in the doorway. She wore his jacket, still far too large for her thin frame, and clutched the edges of the fur collar as if anchoring herself in a dream. Her bare feet sank into the snow, but she didn't flinch. She took one step forward, then another. Her face was pale but composed. Her eyes were wide, ancient, and full of knowing. She looked past Elias. To them, and they looked back at her. The old warrior in the center of the line, the one with white braids and ochre-painted lines down his cheek, dismounted. He walked slowly, deliberately, down the ridge. No one followed. The sound of his boots crunching snow was all that could be heard for miles. Elias turned to the girl, who was now halfway between him and the gate. She walked barefoot through snow, and didn't seem to feel the cold. Her hands trembled as she raised one palm open, fingers spread. The old warrior stopped. Then, after a pause, he mirrored the gesture. A long silence followed. Then the girl, her voice soft but ringing with strength, spoke in a language Elias did not understand. The words moved like wind through pine, elegant, rhythmic, reverent, and, when she finished, every single warrior raised a hand in salute. Elias remained frozen. He understood none of the words, but all of the meaning. This was not random. She was not lost, and these warriors were not strangers. She turned and walked back to Elias, standing just in front of him. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she spoke to him in English. "You saved the daughter of a chief." Elias said nothing. The realization struck him with the weight of thunder. He glanced back at the old warrior, now approaching the fence. The man wore a long leather coat adorned with feathers, beads, and fur. His face was carved from stone, his eyes dark pools of memory. Without a word, he stepped through the open gate and approached Elias. They stood face to face, to men. 2 worlds, 1 moment. The old man reached into a pouch and removed a bundle wrapped in deerskin. He knelt and placed it on the snow before Elias, then stood again, silent. Elias looked down. The bundle contained strips of dried meat, a carved bone pipe, and a bundle of herbs, gifts, symbols, peace offerings. More than that, respect. Elias met the old man's gaze. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Then, one by one, the warriors began to dismount and approach the gate, each placing something before it. Bundles of food, ceremonial trinkets, flint, stones, beads, pelts, silent offerings, silent gratitude. It was overwhelming. Elias, once the man who had spent a decade alone in silence, now stood before 200 warriors who had crossed the land not to challenge him, but to honor him, and all because of a jacket. All because he had seen a girl on the verge of death and had chosen to act. No one spoke. No one needed to. Even the wind had stilled. The girl reached out and took Elias's hand. Her grip was cold, but firm. She didn't look at him as she spoke, but her words were meant for him alone. "You saw me when no one else would. You gave without asking. Now they see you." Elias couldn't speak, not because he didn't have words, because none would have sufficed. The old warrior stepped back and raised his hand again. The others did the same. And then, with a solemn grace, they began to turn and ride one by one back across the ridge, disappearing into the morning mist as silently as they had come. No drums, no shouts, no chants, just the sound of hooves. In fresh snow, Elias watched until the last of them vanished into the horizon. The girl stood beside him, and the cabin behind them, once a place of solitude, now stood as the site of a silent covenant. One act of kindness returned 100-fold. Long after the last hoofprint had vanished into the mist, the gifts remained behind, scattered like prayer offerings at the edge of Elias's fence. It looked like the aftermath of a sacred ceremony. Not an act of war, not a demand, not even a debt repaid. It was something else. A language older than English, or rifles, or paper treaties. A language of symbols, gestures, and silence. Elias didn't touch the gifts at first. He only stared at them, hands stiff at his sides. There were bundles of meat, tightly bound with sinew and painted with ochre patterns. Furs, thick and luxurious, the kind that could trade for a fortune in Pine Hollow. A pouch of obsidian flakes, a carved wooden figure small, detailed, shaped like a man kneeling beneath a tree. Several long-stemmed pipes made of red stone, their bowls carved with animals, buffalo, bear, eagle, wolf, and herbs, bundles of sage, cedar, and sweetgrass, tied with strips of rawhide. Each item had been placed deliberately. Each held meaning. Elias felt it, not as something he could name, but something he could feel in his chest, like pressure behind the ribs. He had lived many years with only practical things, useful things. But this was not about use. It was about understanding, reverence, a kind of thank you too deep for words. The girl, still wrapped in his coat, her bare feet now dry and warm inside a pair of wool socks, stood just behind him, watching. Her expression was unreadable. Not blank, not cold, simply full of memory. Her eyes had seen this before. She knew what these offerings meant, in ways Elias never could. He finally turned to her. "What do I do with them?" he asked quietly. Her gaze didn't leave the gifts. "You accept them," she said, her voice soft. "Not for what you gave me, but for what you reminded them of." Elias furrowed his brow. And what was that? That not all men forget the old ways. He didn't know what to say to that. They stood in silence for a while. The cold air didn't bite as sharply now. The sky had shifted into a full sunrise, gold spilling over the mountains, lighting the land in soft brilliance. Even the snow seemed to glow. Behind them, the fire inside the cabin continued to burn, a gentle rhythm of warmth and crackle. The girl stepped forward and knelt beside one of the bundles. "This," she said, unwrapping it carefully, "is fat and berries, dried together. It's what we take on long journeys. Enough here to last a man a month." She opened another 2 thick pelts of snow, fox, soft as water, for warmth, and another an eagle feather wrapped in deer hide, tucked alongside a small obsidian knife. "This one," she said, holding it reverently, "is not a gift. It's a promise." Elias took a step closer. "Promise of what?" "That your name now lives among ours." He didn't understand it completely, but he didn't have to. Not everything needed understanding to be sacred. She stood again, holding the bundle close. The wind moved gently now, as if breathing with the land instead of against it. Elias looked out over the plains, trying to make sense of the moment, trying to reconcile the man he had been, the loner, the watcher, the one content with solitude, and the man he was now, standing beside a girl he didn't know, holding a knife that meant something bigger than him, surrounded by gifts he hadn't earned in gold, but in something far more rare. Mercy, he thought of the night before, the jacket, the cold, her whisper, North. 100 questions still crowded his mind. Who was she, really? Why had she run? Why alone? What had happened in the north that had driven her south through snow and storm? But he didn't ask yet. Instead, he gestured toward the cabin. "Come inside," he said. "You'll catch your death standing barefoot out here." She gave a faint smile and followed. Inside, Elias gently stacked the offerings on the table, arranging them with care. It felt like handling relics. Every fur, every bead, every leaf of sage held memory. These were not simply things, they were messages. Stories carved into form. The girl stood by the fire, her hands outstretched. She closed her eyes, letting the heat thaw what the wind had taken. Elias brewed tea with cedar and pine needles. When he handed it to her, she took it with both hands, nodded once in quiet thanks, and drank slowly. "You didn't ask my name," she said after a while. "I figured you'd tell me when you were ready." She gave a faint nod. "Naya." Elias repeated it. "Naya." She didn't explain it further, didn't offer a history or family line, just a name. But Elias knew names had weight in her world. In his too. Once, before it got buried under years of silence, Elias said. "I know," she said. "They told me." He frowned. She looked toward the window, where the ridge had now faded into light. The ones who watched, the ones who came. Elias understood then her tribe had been following her journey. Maybe not in sight, but in spirit. Maybe they had known she would come to him. Or maybe her arrival at his gate had awakened something ancient between their people and his land. Either way, it no longer felt like coincidence. Naya sat near the fire and unwrapped the obsidian knife. Her hands moved with practiced care. She stared at the blade, her reflection shimmering across its surface. "You gave me your jacket," she said suddenly, not looking up. "I did. You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask where I came from. You just gave it." "You were cold," he said, simply. She nodded. "That's the old way." Elias tilted his head. "What old way?" "Give before you're asked. Help before there's a price. Share, even if it leaves you with less." He looked at the empty hook near the door where his jacket used to hang. "I didn't think about it much," he said. "Exactly," she replied. That night, they shared a simple meal: salted meat, beans, bread Elias had baked the day before. They didn't talk much, but the silence between them was no longer hollow. It was alive, shared. like a river running underground, quiet but deep. After the meal, Naya added cedar to the fire. The smoke rose in slow spirals. She closed her eyes, whispered a few words into the flames, then sat back. Elias didn't ask what she said. He didn't need to know. He knew she was thanking someone. Maybe the earth, maybe her ancestors, maybe him. As night returned, Elias stood at the window once more. The plains had returned to stillness, but now, something in him was different. He felt less alone, not just because Naja was here, but because something sacred had passed between him and the warriors who had stood at his fence. They had not left guards, they had left a message. We see you now. We remember. We protect our own. And in some strange way, Elias Granger had become part of something he never sought, not because he fought, not because he claimed, but because he had given a jacket to a girl, freezing in the snow. The storm that had threatened to bury the world had passed, but in its wake, something far more enduring had taken root. The days that followed the warrior's silent visit did not erupt in fanfare or declarations. There was no ceremony, no words of allegiance or allegiance returned. Yet everything began to change. It began with small things. Elias woke the next morning to the sound of movement in the yard. Not hooves or footsteps in the snow, but a soft sweeping rhythm. When he pulled aside the curtain, he saw Naya outside, bundled in one of the gifted furs, using a pine branch to brush snow away from the chicken coop. Her movements were slow but practiced, purposeful. She didn't look up at him, but he could tell this was not a guest lingering. This was someone stepping into rhythm. She had chosen to stay. Not with words, not with vows, but with action. Elias dressed, brewed coffee, then met her outside. The snow was waist-high, near the fence, drifted by wind and time, but sunlight was beginning to soften its edges. He offered her a cup. She accepted it, hands cupped around the heat. They stood together for a while, watching the land emerge from white. I used to do this alone, he said. You still can, she replied gently. I know, he said. I just don't want to. She nodded. No smile, no blush. Just a quiet agreement between two people who had known enough loneliness to recognize its end without naming it by noon. They were working side by side. The barn roof had lost a few shingles. Elias steadied the ladder while Naya passed him boards. They didn't speak much, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind that exists between people who trust the silence not to betray them. In the afternoons, Naya fed the goats, her long braids tucked under a fur hood. She didn't shy from work. Elias watched how she moved precise, like someone who had lived her whole life with discipline. Not the kind born of punishment or orders, but the kind born of harmony with the land. She knew how to carry water in balance, how to dry herbs over the stove, how to boil pine needles when Elias started coughing in the evenings, and he began to remember what it meant to share his space. It was subtle at first. He made extra cornbread. He left a pair of his thickest socks by the fire for her to find in the morning. He sharpened her knife without being asked. She, in turn, carved a new handle for his axe, dirty, with wolf paw prints etched along the side. It was not courtship. Not yet. It was coexistence with reverence. On the fourth day, Naya brought him a bowl of stirabout wild onions. Bone Marrowin sat beside him at the table. She looked around the cabin, at the bare shelves, the worn chair, the maps folded neatly in the corner. You built this alone? She asked. I did. Why? Elias leaned back. He hadn't told anyone in years. After the war, he said slowly, I couldn't go back to people. Too loud, too many eyes. I thought, if I could hear the wind again, I'd remember how to live. Naya stirred her stew, listening. And did you? Not until now, he said. She met his eyes, and in that moment, something deeper passed. Between them, not desire, not yet, but a recognition. A shared knowing that some wounds aren't visible, and some healing doesn't come from medicine. That night, the fire crackled low as snow began to fall again. Naya unrolled her bedroll near the hearth. Elias sat nearby, whittling a piece of driftwood he'd found near the river weeks ago. The cabin glowed with warmth. I think the warriors were her kin, Elias said softly. Maybe her uncles, maybe her brothers. Naya didn't answer immediately. They were guardians, she said at last. Not just of me, of the old ways, of the things that still matter when everything else falls apart. Elias nodded slowly. They watched me for years, didn't they? Yes. Why didn't they stop me, or test me? They already knew what kind of man you were, she said. They just waited to see if you remembered. That struck him harder than he expected. All his life, Elias had believed he had earned his solitude, that the land was the only witness he needed. But now, the idea that many someones had watched him in silence, had weighed his character not by words, but by habits. It humbled him. He wasn't just a man with a rifle and a quiet tongue. He was part of a longer story, one he had never been told. Over the next few days, Naya began teaching him things without calling it teaching. She showed him how to braid sweetgrass, how to make tea from juniper berries, how to track elk by the angle of their hoofprints in melting snow. In return, Elias showed her how to reset the windmill pump, how to shoe a horse without breaking its trust, how to read the sky before a storm. They traded knowledge like others traded coin. But more than that, they traded silence for companionship. One evening, as twilight settled like a hush, Naya brought out a small bundle from the corner of her pack. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a flute carved from elder. She held it gently, reverently, and then without a word began to play. The notes rose and fell like wind across tall grass. Elias froze mid-motion, his hands still dusted in flour from kneading bread. He had never heard music like that, not from a radio, not from a saloon piano, not even from memory. It was ancient, a song of rivers and stone and bone and sky. She played with her eyes closed, body swaying gently, and he listened like a man remembering dreams he didn't know he'd lost. When the song ended, she opened her eyes. He didn't speak, didn't need to. She simply wrapped the flute again, set it on the mantel, and joined him at the table. From that night forward, he saw her differently, not as a guest, not as a wanderer, but as someone sent. And perhaps, he dared wonder, someone who had stayed for a reason. The wind howled less in the evenings now. The coyotes still called from the ridge, but their cries felt more like greetings than threats. Elias began sleeping deeper, dreaming longer, and always, he woke to find her there by the fire, or in the barn, or at the edge of the fence, looking out over the snow with eyes that seemed to belong to both worlds. Each day, the fence line seemed less like a boundary, more like a heartbeat. The old loneliness that had ruled the ranch for 20 years was crumbling, not in a dramatic way, but like winter ice slowly melting under the touch of returning sun. One morning, Naya turned to him over breakfast and said, simply, "Spring is coming." Elias nodded, but they both knew she wasn't talking about the weather.